Okay, good afternoon, ladies. I think we're all ladies here. Yeah. I'm Ernestine Berry from the United Keetoowah Band in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And do we have any Cherokees here? Okay. Where are y'all from? Oklahoma City? Ah, okay. I went to school at Oaks when I was little. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation today. We are the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. That's our full title, our full name. I am the director of the John Hare Cultural Center and Museum in Tahlequah. And we have a number of things here that we want to discuss today. And if you have any questions later on, maybe you can ask your questions. And if I know the answer, I'll tell you. And if I don't, I'll tell you that too, I guess. Okay, we have a mission at the John Hare Cultural Center and Museum, and that is to share our history, our culture, and our traditions with the public through exhibits, presentations, and culture demonstrations. And I'm doing a presentation here today, so we're going to share the history of the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians today. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate you being here. Now, what we're going to discuss here, oops, it went to the next slide. What we want to discuss today is who are the Keetoowah Cherokees. Now, you notice up here there's two spellings of it that normally in the East, they spell it the old way, like you see in James Mooney's book or some of the ethnologists from way back in the 19th century who did a lot of studies on the Cherokees. They spell it K-I-T-U-W-A-H. Now, the Western Keetoowahs, or the ones in Oklahoma, they spell it K-E-E-T-O-O-W-A-H, but it still means the same thing. It's still the same people. We are all Keetoowah Cherokees, whichever way it's spelled. The Keetoowahs, the Cherokees, some of them migrated over into Arkansas Territory. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the Keetoowah Cherokees during the Civil War period. We'll talk about the Keetoowahs during the Allotment Period. We'll talk about the Reorganization period and also about current day. Now, we have heard sometimes that the Keetoowahs are a foreign tribe, that we've been given that name, or that we're a bogus tribe, or that we're not a real tribe, or that we're a Johnny-come-lately tribe. We hear all of these things about the Keetoowahs, and none of them are true. Now, the Keetoowahs have always been around. They were always Keetoowahs. Now, the Cherokee name comes from, we don't know where it comes from. We don't know what it means. But we do know that the Keetoowah is the Anika-Duwagi. That's why they say it. That's why they say it in Cherokee. We are Keetoowah. We are people of Keetoowah. And that's a lot of people say that was the original name of the Cherokees. And of course, that happened in prehistory, and there's not a lot of written records about that. So history is never just cut and dried, straightforward. You know, anytime you deal with people, you have sort of people going around, just every direction. And so it's not easy to just totally clarify everything about the Indians especially during the prehistory period. But today we'll try to discuss some of those things. Okay, Anika-Duwagi, that means people of Keetoowah. Now, the people of Keetoowah were from the east in North Carolina principally, but the Cherokees were scattered throughout the Tennessee area, North Carolina, South Carolina, even up into Kentucky. They used part of that for their hunting grounds, and they were in Georgia, northern Georgia, and just a little bit of the northeastern part of Alabama. So they were in that whole region there. But the Keetoowah were basically from a mother town. That's what we call it. It had a lot of influence upon the whole region there, and the sacred fire was there. A lot of the people would come for miles and miles away just to go once a year to get the new flame, because they would clean their houses, they'd clean out their hearth areas, they would get rid of that. Sometimes they would bring it back to the Keetoowah Mound in North Carolina. They would leave their ashes there, and they would get new flame or new fire, coals from the Keetoowah fire, which was considered a sacred fire, and they'd take it back to their home and restart their fires in their home. So it was an area that was considered very sacred with the people. And Ani Keetoowah, people of Keetoowah, and Ani Yunwiya. And we have, the Keetoowahs have that on their flag now, both of it written in the Cherokee syllabary of Sequoia. Ani Keetoowah and Ani Yunwiya. That means the real people. Now, with a lot of tribes in the United States, that's what they call themselves, is the real people or the principal people or just the people. And a lot of us got names from people like Cherokee. That comes from some other tribe, we think. Some people say it's Choctaw, some people say it's Creek, and you know, they kind of guess. These ethnologists, they want you to think that they know it all, that they can just tell you what it is. Well, they don't know, and there's been guesses on what it might be and where it came from, but we don't really have any real firm idea of where the name Cherokee came from, because it's not from the language of the people. So the Keetoowah place was the mythical birthplace of the Ani Keetoowah. But there also is a legend about the Keetoowahs that I have heard in growing up, is that the Keetoowah people came, or the Cherokee people, came from the islands in the south, in the Caribbean. Came from one of the Caribbean islands. Now, I've heard that legend. And the ethnologists categorize the language of the Cherokees in with the Iroquois, but they do say that it is the most aberrant, or it's the most different from any of the other Iroquois languages. So whether there's other Iroquois tribes that came from the Caribbean, we don't know. And we're not, this is just a legend that has been told over the centuries, apparently. And a lot of times there's a little bit of truth to a legend. So, and usually it grows, though, and it becomes more than what it was. But that's the legend that I've heard about the origin of the Cherokee people. Okay. Now, there was people who came from Europe, of course. And when they began to come into contact on a daily basis with the Cherokee people, which was around 1700, 1690, one ethnologist said 1690 into 1700s. Now, they became in more contact with the Europeans. And as that happened, then there became more and more intermarriages and more taking on of European ways. And that caused a separation of the people. That caused some different things to happen. Taking on of European ways. Now, the slavery issue, that wasn't something that the original people did, that the principal people, the people did. There was no slavery there. But when the Europeans came, some of the Cherokees who had plantations, they began to acquire plantations and build big buildings and big homes and so on and so forth. They took on the slavery thing from the Europeans. And so, but then the Keetoowahs, who were the more traditional, and the full-bloods in Oklahoma, that name became associated with the full-bloods and the more traditional Cherokees. And then there was the more advanced, or the civilized so-called Cherokees. Do you know the Cherokee is considered one of the 5 civilized tribes? I have a lot of trouble with that. I don't like being called civilized. Not that I want to be totally uncivilized, but I don't like being called civilized because what they mean is that they took on the European ways. Not that they were more civilized, but that they were more like the Europeans. And so that's what happened in sort of creating the classes among the Cherokees, was taking on the European ways and the intermarriage, and those that didn't intermarry and those that were the traditionals. They wanted to maintain their traditional way of living, hunting, gathering, and that kind of thing. And so that's what made it very difficult for, and still, it's still kind of that way. When you go into the full-blood communities, they live very poorly, even today. And most of them do. And then you go to the ones who are mixed bloods. They were called mixed bloods. There's some now. The Cherokee Nation has no blood degree requirement, and so they have some that are like maybe 1/2000th degree Cherokee blood. But they are the ones who are the more affluent and have more than the full bloods, and it's still that way today. Okay. This is not really the slide from the museum. It's okay. Okay, the Keetoowahs, or some of the Cherokees, migrated from the east to the west, and some of them, the Keetoowahs were known as the red part of the tribe. There was the white, which was the peace. During peace times they functioned, and the red that functioned during times of war. And so a lot of the Keetoowahs, they were known as the red portion of the tribe because they guarded the northern borders of the territory. And some of them were allied with the French during the 7 Years' War, or commonly called the French and Indian War. They were allied with the French. And so that kind of gave them, when they lost, some of those started across the Mississippi River in 1763. And that was the first contingency of them that went across into the West. And then during the American Revolution, a lot of our Cherokees were allied with the British. Can you see there? They're wanting to get rid of the Americans because the Americans had come in and had taken a lot of things away from them. So they were allying with the enemies of the American, hoping that maybe they could overcome that. Now, of course, it didn't happen. And the Chickamaugas, they were the last group of Cherokees, and they got to be called Chickamaugas because that's where they lived. On Chickamauga Creek, they had their camps and so forth there. And they fought the Americans. They were the last group to keep fighting the Americans. And finally, when the Cherokee Wars were over, they went across the Mississippi and joined up with the Keetoowahs, or the Cherokees who were there. And over a period of time, there came to be about 6,000 in the Arkansas Territory. Now, in 1803, there was the Louisiana Purchase, which included the Arkansas Territory. And so they were trying to escape the U.S. or the Americans when they came across the Mississippi. And then in 1803, there they were under the authority of the Americans again. So what they did was they went to Washington and requested to have a reservation there in Arkansas. And they actually were given a reservation in Arkansas. And they were there only for 11 years before they were forced on over into Oklahoma, where they became known as the Old Settlers, or the Western. The Treaty of 1817 gave us the land in Arkansas. And my people, my ancestors were Western Cherokees. My great-great-grandmother was still living when I was about 5 years old. I could just barely remember her. But she was one, her parents were ones that came from Arkansas over into Indian Territory in 1828. In 1828, the government forced us to move on over into Indian Territory. And because we were the first Cherokees there, we became known as the Old Settler Cherokees. And then in 1838-39, then the rest of the Cherokees came. But there had been a group in 1835 that signed away all the land in the east, and they came into Indian Territory ahead of the Trail of Tears also, as we did. And the Trail of Tears was the last group that were forced out militarily, and it was a very sad time. And that was talked about this morning, which I won't try to redo that. But I'll just go ahead and tell you about what happened to the old settlers and what happened during various times of their history. Okay, I think I've already told you about that one. Let's skip on to the next one. Okay, they officially got a reservation in 1817. They're recognized as a separate tribe, the Western Cherokees. They set up a government, their civic organizations and everything. And by 1822, they had also a mission established by the Presbyterian Board of Missions in Arkansas. And this is a depiction of that. Some of the older Cherokees there, they did not want to have Christian religion, but they realized the value of teaching their children to live among white people because we had to do that. And by that time, they had decided there was not going to be any reversal of fortune, so to speak, because we had been driven out of the east and then into the Arkansas Territory and then on over into Oklahoma. And so we had to readjust all the time, keep readjusting everything. And so we realized, our people, our leaders realized that there was value in knowing how to read and write and having knowledge of the way that the Europeans lived. And so they did allow, under Chief Tolentesky, they allowed the missions to come in. But it wasn't something that they all agreed on. Okay. In 1838, the last group came. In 1839, there was an Act of Union, which the Act of Union was supposed to take all the Cherokees and put them all back together again. Well, you know, really, they had never really been that way because they had individual towns in the east where they lived, and they each had their chief. There was never just one chief before Europeans came. That was an adaptation to the European way, was to have one chief. And the government wanted that way because it was easier to deal with just one man than it was to deal with a whole council. So they did adapt to that, and the Cherokees that came in 1838 and 39, they became known as the Eastern immigrants. They had already taken on a lot of the European ways, and I think they were hoping that taking on all those ways would ingratiate them more to the U.S. government, and maybe they'd be able to hold on to their land, onto the ancestral lands in the east. But it didn't work, and so they were driven out militarily. And the Act of Union that was brought in by Chief John Ross, because he was the chief of the Eastern immigrants, it didn't really work either, because the old settlers had been there for 11 years before the newcomers came. They were more numerous, and so they wound up taking over the government. But it was never something that the old settlers wanted to have. Okay, we'll go now to the Civil War period. Now, the Civil War was a time of great division with the Cherokees. And the more traditional, full-blood Cherokees, again, there's that division. They decided that they did not want to fight the white man's war, but they knew they had been dragged into every war that had happened, the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, the War of 1812, and again here in the Civil War. They decided that they didn't want to fight, but if they did, they would take the side of the North. And that's, let's see, it says right in there that they didn't want to fight, but they would take the side of the North if they had to, because the southern states had always pushed them out, kept pushing them and taking their land, kept pushing them and taking their land. They said, we don't want to be part of that. We don't want to fight for them. So if we have to, we'll fight with the North and not with the South. Okay, whenever it came time to fight, though, they had asked, and Chief John Ross, who was chief of the Cherokees at that time, he did not want to fight either. He only wanted people to guard the homeland, and which was what the Keetoowahs wanted to do. And so they were allied with him because of that, because they were philosophically, they were pretty much the same. So, but when it came down to it, they could not get support from the Union to fight in or to guard their home in the Cherokee Nation. So they had a big meeting downtown. They voted, and they talked about it. They voted, and they said, well, it looks like we're surrounded on every side by Confederates, and so we can't get any response from the Union, and so it looks like we're going to have to sign up with the South. And so they did. They signed up with the South. The Keetoowahs incorporated, or the Keetoowahs also threw in with them because John Ross was signing up, and they were mustered into the Confederacy. That was in November of 1861. And then around by July of 1862, all of them had deserted almost to a man. I think there was about 60 of them left that had not deserted the South and went to the North. First thing they were supposed to do was go out and intercept Chief Yahola, who was a Creek chief who was going into Kansas, taking some of his men into Kansas, and families and black slaves. They were all going into Kansas to get away from the war because they didn't want to fight either. And so the Keetoowahs went and they intercepted Yahola at Bird Creek, close to Tulsa. And when they intercepted him, they joined up with him, and some of them went on into Kansas, and some of them just went home. And because John Ross, the chief of the Cherokees, needed those Keetoowah people, he needed those men to fight, he forgave them and put them back into service in the Confederacy. And then the next time they had to go out and fight, they said, they had told him, we don't want to fight other Indians, we don't want to fight our brothers, the Cherokees, we don't want to fight the white man's war. But they were commanded to go, and when they did, they joined up with the Union and went back into Kansas. And over a period of those months, there was the men, all except for about 60 of them, had gone into the Confederacy. My great-great-great-grandfather was a captain in the Union 3rd Home Guard out of Kansas. He fought for the Union. And that's what the Keetoowahs did. They wound up fighting with the Union and not the Confederacy, because that's what they had said they would do from the very beginning. And if you know full bloods, you know they're stubborn. And whatever they say and make up their mind, a lot of them will hang with it. They won't give it up. And I think that, maybe that's why we're still in existence, because they had that stubborn streak in them that they were going to exist anyway, regardless of what was going on. The Keetoowahs were fighting in that war, but they were fighting for the North, and of course, where they lived, there were Confederate Cherokees. There were more Confederates than there were Union. And so they developed secret ways of communication. They had a certain way that they would put pins under their collar or their lapel. And if they were in a group of people, if they went like that, they show you their pins, and that person might not know what it was. If he didn't know what it was, then he was not Keetoowah. And if he was Keetoowah, then he would show his pins like that. Also, they had a certain way of touching their hat brim. And if the guy across the room went, then they would know that they were safe. And they met in the woods at night, and they had a secret code word that you had to answer them. They'd say, "Who are you?" And if he said, "I'm Keetoowah's son," then they knew that they were safe, because they had to be very vigilant because of the Confederate Cherokees, who were far more numerous than they. And so that's how they survived, by creating these different things. And because of the pins under the collar and the lapel, they became known as Pin Indians. Now, the pins were Keetoowahs. They were not Cherokee Nation. They were Keetoowahs. And some people want to say that they were Cherokee Nation, but they were not. They were Keetoowahs who fought for the Union. Although they fought for the Union, they were not given any consideration, any special consideration, when during the Treaty of 1866, following the Civil War, when a lot of the tribe was forced to allow the railroads to come through. A lot of land was taken away. Privileges were taken away. The Keetoowahs got nothing special for their having fought for the Union. Okay, during the allotment period. Now, the allotment period was a period of time when the government had decided that they would do away with the reservation. They'd do away with owning land in common. Now, when they owned land in common, that meant that everybody owned the land. And actually, they felt like that they did not own the land, that the Creator owned the land, and He only allowed them to use it. And so, but the government decided that they were going to take away all the reservations, and I think probably the discovery of oil in the 1890s had something to do with that. They discovered oil in Bartlesville and in the Cherokee Nation, in the Cherokee part of the state. They discovered oil, and so there was the Dawes Act, the Curtis Act, and then the Cherokee Agreement. The Cherokee decided, or they had their own agreement for allotment, and they were allowed to vote on it. They voted, and it passed for allotment. Now, the Keetoowahs were very opposed to that, very opposed. And they were teaching and telling their people, do not sign up for allotment. Don't do it. Don't go in and vote for that. And so the Keetoowahs all stayed home. They did not vote. And somebody said, well, if they had gone in and voted, it wouldn't have passed. Well, it was only a matter of time, because the government had already decreed that it would be so. And it didn't matter if the Keetoowahs all voted against it and it was voted down. Eventually, it would have passed anyhow, because the government had already decreed it to be so. So they were forced, some of them, Daniel Hummingbird, who was one of the Keetoowah leaders. The Keetoowah leaders went out, the military, the dragoons from Fort Gibson, were sent out to collect the Keetoowah leaders and put them in jail. So they were put in jail, and they were forced to accept their allotments. And the allotment was when they took the reservation and they gave each person individual ownership of the land. And so they were forced to accept their allotments. And they said, Daniel Hummingbird said, I want my children, my grandchildren, to know that we did not willingly do this. And so they put them in jail, and they got their allotments. Many of the Keetoowahs who did not come in did not receive allotments, and then in the eyes of the government, they were not considered Indians, and they became landless. They had no land at all. So it was a very sad time, especially for the Keetoowahs, when they did the land allotments. Now, my grandmother got a land allotment. My grandfather did too. My grandfather sold his. My grandmother still held on to hers, and she always told us, don't sell the land, don't sell the land, which we still have over 100 acres that belong to her. And so we're trying not to sell it. We're trying to keep it so that we still have it. And she did not want to sell her land to anybody that was not a tribal member. And so we still have it thanks to her and her idea. Okay, in 1905, well, the Cherokee Nation, and this was what was in the Curtis Act, that the Indian governments in Oklahoma would all be taken away. There would be no more Indian governments. After allotment was a time when that land was given out and the governments were terminated. The Cherokee Nation government was terminated. It was supposed to be the last day. It was March the 4th, 1906, that their government was gone. And so, but the Keetoowahs, they wanted that government. They wanted that identification to them that identified them as Native people, not to be thrown in with the rest of the general population. And it was very important to them that they be identified as Indian people. And if you think about it, you know, there's no other place on earth where there will be Indian people. Now, if you're Irish, you're descended from Irish, there's Ireland. There's always going to be Irish. If you're English, there's Great Britain. There's England. There's always going to be English. If you're descended from the Germans, there's Germany. But if you're American Indian, this is it. There won't be any more than what we have right here. So we have to try to protect that. Okay. The government was dissolved, 1906. The Keetoowahs said, we don't want that to happen. And so we're going to go to the federal court and we're going to get us a certificate of incorporation that we will be recognized as a body politic. And whenever there is problems with the land, which they knew there would be, there always had been problems with the Indian land. People trying to take their land, stealing it away from them, defrauding them one way or another to get their land. And so they said, okay, we know that's going to happen. It always has. So let's go and get where we can fight in the courts. And that's exactly what they did. They went to the federal court there in Tahlequah, and they got a certificate of incorporation. This slide here tells you about the Keetoowahs, how they felt about their government. That at the bottom you see it says that fair-minded men would not fault us, and surely we will not be blamed if we do not take part in the annihilation of our government. And that was the way they felt about it. This is from a newspaper during that time in 1901 from the Tulsa Democrat. The Keetoowahs were very active during that time. We found a lot of newspaper articles about the full-blood Keetoowahs during that allotment period, how they objected to it and how they hated it and how they were very saddened because of it. So we know that they were Cherokee, yes, but they were sort of a separate group all the time, because most of them were full-bloods. And on our 1949 base roll, the majority of people on that base roll are full-blood Cherokees. There are a few that are not, but the majority are full-bloods. Okay. They went to the court. They got their certificate of incorporation. It was approved. This is a picture of it right here. How that they organized in order to be a body politic so that they could still have some form of government to represent the people. And they did fight court cases for land. They went to the courts, and Frank J. Boudinot was their attorney. He fought in the courts for the Cherokees by blood. Now, by this time, there were Shawnees that had been put into the Cherokee tribe. There were Delawares that were, they called them Cherokee Delawares. There were the intermarried whites in the Cherokee Nation. There were the black freedmen in the Cherokee Nation because they had been freed just after the Civil War, and they had been put into as equal citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And, of course, then there was Cherokees. So when the Keetoowahs decided to form their government, they decided that they did not want that. And during the reorganization period, they determined that they would be a government of the Cherokee people only, not including all those other groups. And so whenever the reorganization period came about, that was through the 1934 Act, which was called the Indian Reorganization Act. Now that was for all the tribes, even on the reservations. That act mainly addressed the reservation Indians. But in Oklahoma, there were no reservations after the allotment period. And so in 1936, they passed the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, which addressed the situation of the Indians in Oklahoma. And it gave them a chance to reorganize their governments. So the Keetoowahs said, yes, we want to do that. That's our identity. We love it. That's who we are. We can't deny who we are. We're full-bloods. We can't deny that we're Indian. We look Indian, we sound Indian, we speak the language. And a lot of them spoke nothing else but Cherokee. They only spoke Cherokee. There was no English. In a lot of the full-blood communities, there was no English spoken. It was all Cherokee. And so they said, yes, we want to reorganize our government, but we want it to be for our people. And so they got their government together, they applied, and they finally were recognized in 1936, or 1946. This just shows up the election notice. They had a provisional government during the time that they were trying to organize for recognition under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. They had a provisional government, and this is where they had their election. This is the Constitutional Committee that they had at that time. All of them are Keetoowahs except the one on the upper right. That's the attorney there. And these are the men who wrote our Constitution and our federal corporate charter. Now, we have a Constitution, and we were allowed to have a federal corporate charter. Now, what the federal corporate charter does, it gives us the right to have businesses under the tribal authority. Now, Cherokee Nation does not have that because they are not organized under the OIWA. The Keetoowahs were recognized in 1946. But the Cherokee Nation and their leaders did not attempt to organize under that. At that time, there is one letter that we have in our file. It says that it was not perceived at that time that the old Cherokee Nation should ever be revived, that it would be a new organization under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. And so that's what the Keetoowahs were, and they had to prove that they had at some time or other acted as a government, which they did by having their Keetoowah Constitution of 1859. They took it to Washington here, and they showed it to the Indian office here, and it was all written in the syllabary. And they said, well, this is all well and good, but we can't read it. So what you have to do is take it back and transcribe it, and then we'll take a look at it. So they did. They had it transcribed into English, brought it back, and we have a copy of it. We don't have the original one, but we do have a copy of it. Darcy McNichol was one of the ones that did the research for the recognition of the Keetoowahs. And he says, the record seems to indicate that the Keetoowah group did exercise independent political action even at the point of initiating hostile proceedings. It has been a formally organized body at least since 1858 with representative districts and for many years had a common leadership. And those were the things that they were looking for in order to recognize the Keetoowahs or any tribe under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. And so the fact that they had the Constitution and that they had fought against the main body of the Cherokees in the Civil War. So they had initiated that hostile proceedings is what that means, that they fought during the Civil War on the opposite side. So they had indeed at a time acted as and could prove that they had acted as a government. Now, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior was Abe Fortas at that time, and they also had an investigation of who the Keetoowahs were, and they had a big report written up on it. We have a copy of it, and this was written or read into the congressional minutes during the 1945 session. And it says, a written constitution was adopted at a general convention on April 29, 1859. In later years, the Keetoowahs tried to prevent the allotment of the Cherokee tribal lands. They employed attorneys to prosecute the Eastern Cherokee cases, 1903 through 1906, and H.R. 341 has been introduced, and that he urged that it be enacted. So they had written up a bill to approve the Keetoowahs under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act as a tribe to organize under those acts. And this is just a copy of that bill that was passed in August the 10th, 1946, recognizing the Keetoowah organization as a band of Cherokees under the authority of that act. The Constitution was approved by William E. Warren in 1950, so it took us a period of 4 years before we were able to get federal recognition or to get the approval on our legal documents to be the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians. Now, the reason that we are called the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokee Indians, some people say we're the Western Cherokees, and yes, indeed, we are the Western Cherokees, because I'm a descendant of the Western Cherokees, and there are others in the United Keetoowah Band who are descendants of the Western Cherokees. But we are also the Eastern immigrants as well, because we have those people in our membership as well. So we have the Eastern immigrants, the Treaty Party, who were those in 1835 who signed the Treaty of New Echota, giving away the land. We have some of those descendants, and we have the descendants of the Western Cherokees. So we are a group of all Cherokees from all the different groups. And indeed, we are from also the Western Cherokee. History is never very straight line and clean cut and easy to understand. It always goes out in different directions, and trying to gather all that up is always kind of difficult. Okay, this is our modern day chiefs, starting with our provisional chief, who was John Hitcher, and he died in 1946, the same year that we won the recognition under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. And then to all of our chiefs have been able to speak the Cherokee language fluently, and including our current chief, who is George Wycliffe. There's only one here, James Gordon, who did not speak fluently. He could speak some, wasn't really fluent, but all the rest of them were fluent in the Cherokee language. And I don't know about the Cherokee Nation whether their chiefs can always speak. I don't think the current one does, but that is one thing that we have tried to hold to, was that they be fluent Cherokee speakers. Who knows what will happen next time? Okay, and that's all I have today. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it so much. And if you want to be bored to death again tomorrow at 3, you can come. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.